Damas y caballeros, welcome back to From Across the Pond. I'm your host, Raipal Mula, and today we're here to preview the 2022 Colorado Rapids season. With me to provide expert analysis, I have Joseph Samuelson. First off, how are you, mate? And thank you for sparing the time.
I'm doing so great. Thank you for having me on your show. I'm really happy to talk about the Rapids. Yeah, thank you for having me aboard.
No, absolutely, no problem. So there's no better place to start than last season. Well, obviously, the Rapids finished with the best record in the Western Conference in the regular season, outlasting the Seattle Sounders and the Sporting Kansas City, completing a remarkable turnaround from before Robin Fraser took over from, languishing near the bottom of the Western Conference to finishing up top. So what do you think last season meant for the organization in general, the players, Robin Fraser, and the fans?
Last season was huge for the club. And at the end of the 2017 season, when general manager Porg Smith took over like the full general manager duties at the club, they published an op-ed in the Denver Post, which is the paper of record here in Colorado. And in it, they basically outlined a vision to go to, or I guess in which they were going to build the Rapids way. And it took a while for the club to get there. The last time the club had a truly really strong season was in 2016. And in that op-ed, the general manager talked about how the club had, I guess, not built sustainable success with that 2016 season. For those that remember who were around then, the team was a very bunker counter heavy team. And they wanted to sort of transition into a free-flowing, sort of attacking, possession-oriented style. And what happened over the next 2 years, one pretty bad head coaching hire almost derailed that whole vision. At the start of 2018, they brought in Anthony Hudson, and 2 seasons of pretty mediocre results ultimately forced him, kicked him to the curb. And they brought in Robin Fraser, who's been magnificent for the Rapids turnaround.
Yeah, and obviously talking about the sustainable success that the club have looked towards, this season, one of the big departures from the Rapids has been Cole Bassett, kind of along that sustainable success, creating that production line, previously with Sam Vines going in the middle of the season as well. So is that the kind of model that the Rapids are trying to progress to, kind of a production of talent coming in and then going out?
Absolutely. That's one of the things they spoke about in that op-ed I mentioned, and how over the last few years, they've really put a lot of resources into their academy, and with the intent to develop players, sell them for profit abroad, and reinvest that money into the club. You may know that the Rapids are owned by the same sort of ownership group as Arsenal. So there is a lot of money in ownership, but they don't really invest that money into the club directly. The club has to rely on basically the mechanisms within MLS to make money, whether it be selling players within the league or trading around to improve parts of the squad, or bringing in academy players who they can then develop and turn into solid contributors. And they've been very very great at doing that. So ever since that sort of shift in philosophy, and that was a long time coming, and obviously academies aren't built overnight, but the amount of investment that the club is putting into the academy and into youth soccer here in Colorado is pretty impressive. And I think we have reason to believe that we're going to see more and more young talents come through the club and then be sold on, like Sam Vines and like Cole Bassett. The next one I'd keep an eye out on is Sebastian Anderson, who's a 2-sided fullback, played all last year for the club's lower division affiliate, and had a really solid season at that level. We're going to hope that this year he gets more time with an MLS and with the first team.
Yeah, lovely. And then obviously the other big departure in the engine room of the side in the midfield was Kellen Acosta being traded for a big fee over to LAFC. So do you foresee, obviously with 2 big players from this last year's side moving on, Robin Fraser looking to change the shape of the team, or do you think that the third midfield spot in his current system will be filled with a rotation of the young players like Mayaka or the new draft pick or Max, who came in to replace Cole Bassett? Or change of shape, or do you see like a rotation of those young players?
We could see a change in shape. It's a good point about the departures of Kellen Acosta and Cole, but it's worth noting that both players went through periods of 2021 in which they were completely out of the team for completely different reasons. Like, so there was a period where Bassett had a little bit of a dip in form, and so he was out of the team for a while. And Kellen, of course, was with the U.S. national team for, I want to say, like 6 international windows in 2021, and that resulted in him, I think, only making something in the range of 22 appearances or something like that. It's hardly a number you would have expected for one of the team's, I guess, highest paid players. I think we could either see the formation shift. Robin Fraser has historically used a 4-2-3-1 in addition to his 3 at the back system, but I also think it's reasonable for them to retain their, the shape that got them to the top of the Western Conference last year, in which we regularly saw, either three central midfielders, and 2 attacking players up front, or swap those numbers around, like sort of 2 central midfielders and 3 attackers, like sort of a 3-5-2-1 at times. And most likely we could see Max coming in playing in one of those attacking midfield roles. I could see that being very likely, although, if his social media is to be believed, he hasn't arrived with the team yet in preseason. So there might be a little bit of a sort of learning curve as the season starts, as he sort of beds into the side. And it's worth noting that the re-entry draft pick they made in Brian Acosta, Honduran international, had intermittent bits of solid and mediocre form with FC Dallas. One thing that's worth noting is that the Rapids have been very solid at taking players who have been poor elsewhere in the league, or I guess haven't reached their potential elsewhere in the league, and sort of turning them into really good contributors. So I could expect him to sort of fill into Acosta's midfield role, sort of being a little bit more of, or I guess providing a little bit more defense to the midfield. But yeah, I think the formation shift is possible. I think sticking with the same thing is possible. We'll get an idea of what they're looking at tomorrow, actually. Tomorrow, as if we're recording this, because on Saturday they play their first preseason game against Sporting KC.
Yeah, and like you say, there's a possibility for all things. But you mentioned previously about a possible breakout player for this season being Samuel Anderson. But do you see Philip Mayako making a push to start many games in next season? Obviously, it usually takes players, even draft picks and foreign players, coming in a year to kind of embed in the system and the way that MLS is. But do you see him pushing on, or maybe Max cementing a starting spot?
I could definitely see that from Mayaka. He was very highly touted when the team drafted him in 2021. I think his coach said something to the effect of that he was the most MLS ready prospect that he had ever seen. And that gave us a lot of hope that we would see him. But last year, he spent most of the year on loan at the USL affiliate in Colorado Springs, and wasn't really able to lock down a key starting role. I mean, he made about 20 odd appearances or something like that, but a lot of those were off the bench, and he wasn't sort of a regular fixture of that team. So that's given me a little bit of pause in terms of like what my expectations are for him this year. But I still think, new year, new season, it's totally possible that he could have an amazing preseason, force his way into the team. And honestly, the Rapids need the help in midfield, especially considering those 2 losses in Kellen and Cole. But yeah, that's the thing about the way the Rapids have built this team, is that there are a lot of players who sort of are antsy to get into those starting roles and who can all make a case to be there. Last year, we saw the team rotate constantly. I think there were only 5 players who had over 30 appearances in the league. So the team was regularly trying out new ideas, giving players chances that, under previous management might not have been given those chances. So I think Mayaka definitely has a solid shot to jump into the lineup, but we'll see with time.
No, definitely. And last season, one of the strengths of the team as a whole was kind of its sharing accountability, and that happened with the goal scoring. So 18 players bagged a goal last season, with diminutive playmaker Michael Barrios leading the way with 8 goals, but striker Diego Rubio only scored 5. So is the number 9 slot something that the Rapids have to look to fill with a prolific goal scorer if they want to take their next step?
100%. That is the top priority for the rest of the transfer window. Last week, when Porg Smith addressed media, he spoke about that the club has several targets that they're looking at in terms of the number 9 position, and that I think his exact quote was like, we continue our quest for a number 9. So the club is clearly not happy with the production of what they have up front currently. That isn't to say that the team is going to be, I guess, woeful without a striker. It's just not going to reach its potential. We've seen teams all across MLS invest heavily in attacking players this transfer window. Even a club like FC Dallas, which is typically known for playing homegrown talent, like they sold Ricardo Pepi to Augsburg, and then reinvested that money into a marquee South American attacking talent. I forget his name, but I'm sure we'll know it as the season goes along. The same goes with like a host of other clubs in the league. Philadelphia has invested strong at the striker position. Houston has as well. So the Rapids are in quite a bit of danger of being left behind from the rest of the league, I think, if they do not invest in that position. But the good news is that it is absolutely a priority for the club. That the biggest question is whether or not that's something that's going to be handled before the season starts or sometime in the summer. I think if they wait until the summer, the chances that the club will repeat as regular season Western Conference champs is very low. That doesn't mean it can't happen, but I think that the team will have like a lot of problems. Like that was the biggest problem last year, honestly. Even with the addition of Dominic Baji mid-season, the Rapids had consistent issues sort of finishing their chances and closing out games. We've seen from Fraser's system that they're really great at sort of creating opportunities for the team, which is why so many players have scored a goal. But without somebody who can reliably finish, especially someone, like in my opinion, they need somebody very tall, because Fraser's style of play relies on a lot on crossing. They need someone who's good on, headers and sort of just honestly just putting the ball in frame. That was the biggest problem last year, is that so many chances went to waste, either because the shots were, I guess, too light and the goalkeeper could easily handle it, or they just went over the bar. If they get a goal scorer, this team has especially before the start of the season, they have a strong chance of repeating their finish. And if they don't, we're probably looking at a ceiling of 4th or 5th in the West.
Yeah. Do you think, you were talking previously, and everyone's seen it with the Rapids, about how they take their distressed assets from other clubs around MLS and kind of give them a new lease of life? Do you think that we could see potentially a Jozy Altidore signing and a new lease of life for him in Colorado? Would that be something that
It's so funny that you mentioned that, because that has been Jozy Altidore has been a point of speculation really ever since the distressed assets model began in Colorado. People have been, or fans here have been looking at Jozy Altidore, or at least from what I've seen on social media, they've been looking at Jozy Altidore as like, we got to get him, turn his career around. I could see it happening. I don't think it's out of the question, but I would think it would be a major, if that is the striking option that they choose to go with for the year, it would be a disappointment relative to what they have been able to bring elsewhere on the pitch. Like, historically, it's really difficult to get a distressed asset striker. because most strikers who are, regular goal scorers, unless there's a major locker room issue, there's no reason why they would, leave their current club, or, unless they're trying to go abroad. So yeah, like, I mean, I could see it, but honestly, like with his injury history would give me like really cause for concern. It'd have to be the right deal, and even if it was the right deal, like money wise, they'd need to have. I feel they would also need to get somebody else. So it would be a nice addition, but I still think they would need to find someone who's very reliable, who's also very healthy, because that's been the biggest problem with Jozy.
No, absolutely. And then you were talking about the potential for them maybe filling the spot, or maybe looking into filling it in the summer. So there's obviously the three DP spots are all open at the moment. So you think it's more likely that they're going to be filled in the summer as opposed to before the start of the season?
Well, I think, I mean, if history's indication, in any indication, we will only see one of those three DP spots filled. In terms of when it's most likely to be filled, that's honestly anyone's guess. The club has historically played information regarding transfers pretty close to the vest, and not a lot of stuff leaks before it actually happens. So we'll see. I mean, like I said earlier, I think if they do wait to the summer, it's a mistake. I mean, at least it'll hurt their chances this season of doing really well. I mean, in the playoffs, like with the playoff system, anything is possible in the postseason. But in terms of like sort of repeating that finish, that'll be very difficult. But it's worth noting that because of the budget and the way the Rapids operate, like in conversations I've had with Porg in the past, he's been very explicit that they see the DP slots as nothing more than just sort of another accounting mechanism in MLS. So as you may know, players who have salaries of 1.5 million or less, they can be bought down with targeted allocation money. And even though they're over the max charge, that's historically been players that end up becoming designated players. But the way the Rapids front office sees it is they see sort of DPs are players that sort of fit in that same salary range that they can't use allocation money to buy down for whatever reason. So as you may know, the salary cost and the transfer fee of a player both contribute to the player's cap hit. So because of that, if you bring in a player on like a 1.5 million salary and a $1 million transfer fee, that player cannot be bought down using allocation money. That player has to fall into the DP slot. So when we're talking about designated players from the Rapids perspective, they're really just looking at players that, I mean, most of the rest of the league would consider to be like TAM or allocation players. And there's a variety of reasons behind that. Some people say it's the budget. Some people say it's just because the Rapids front office has told me that they don't like having players with significant salary disparities from the rest of the team. So that's also a consideration for the club. But yeah, like in terms of when they're going to fill it, it's honestly anyone's guess.
Yeah. And then obviously with the success from last season, finishing atop the Western Conference, they have to look forward to the CONCACAF Champions League. So that's obviously brought the side back earlier than the other MLS teams, because that's prior to the season starting. So they face Guatemalan side Comunicaciones in the round of 16, with a potential tie against New York City FC in the quarterfinal. Do you see that's a competition that Colorado could go on a run in?
I mean, it's something they could. History would say otherwise. The Rapids this year have been explicit that they are taking it seriously. That's what the front office has said in media appearances. But it's, in 2011, when the club was in the Champions League, the team's coach at the time had less than positive things to say about accommodations in Central America. He notably didn't travel to an away game at the time in 2018 or 2017, excuse me. I remember getting that year wrong. 2018. Yeah, in 2018, when Anthony Hudson was head coach, the Rapids were also in the Champions League, and they played Toronto FC in the opening leg of the first round. And the Anthony Hudson said after the game, after 2-0 defeat, he said that it was just preseason. So it wasn't something they cared about at the time. Now, at the time, he had inherited a team that was, had major turnover. It's kind of understandable, even though, that comment inspired a lot of ire and anger from the fan base. But, they say they're taking it seriously this year. Comunicaciones has only ever played 4 matches against MLS teams in the Champions League. Both home matches they played against Seattle and LA were draws, and both road matches they played in the US were significant defeats. So the table is set for the Rapids to have a nice run to start the season. But it's worth noting that this side, Comunicaciones, they took Club America, one of the premier teams in North America, to penalty kicks in 2020's Champions League. They're hardly a team to sort of write off. And, if you were a betting man on like the history of the Rapids, it probably wouldn't be wise to place, put significant money on them advancing. That doesn't mean it can't happen.
It's just looking at the draw, there's obviously on their side of the draw, you've got Comunicaciones, who they're playing in the round of 16. Then potentially, if they go through, New York City FC in the quarterfinals, and then the only Liga MX side, who obviously always historically win this competition, the Liga MX side on their side of the draw is Leon, who would be playing Seattle if they both advance in the quarterfinal. And with none of the big sides from Liga MX in the draw this year, no Tigres, no Monterrey, and no Club America, I think maybe there's an opening for one of the MLS sides.
Yeah, and listen, like people, I get my hopes up every year. I've been watching the CONCACAF Champions League longer than a lot of people like that I meet who are fans. And like, listen, every year we get our hopes up, and every year it comes crashing down. So I'm choosing to I guess, apply a little pessimism in advance, just because I feel like I'll be a lot more excited if it does come to fruition. But yeah, it does seem like this is a pretty solid year for them to make a run. Now, we were just talking about strikers. If the Rapids had made that striker signing, a week or 2 ago, and it was already lined up ahead of preseason, I would be betting on their chances. I would think they would have a really strong chance to progress through the tournament. But honestly, like that's the biggest problem with this team, is that the lack of a finisher has made winning knockout matches difficult. The club hasn't won a single knockout match since in any sort of tournament, be it the Cup or MLS playoffs or Champions League, since 2017. That's a 5-year drought. It's been a long time since they won any sort of knockout match in a competition. And even then, that knockout match was against a lower division team in Oklahoma City Energy. So it's not like, when the Rapids go into playoffs, they tend to keel over. And that's just because they don't have someone they can rely on to finish chances. Like, goals by committee is great for the regular season and is going to do well to see the Rapids consistently make the playoffs, which is what, a lot of us here are honestly just happy to see, given the history of the club in the 2010s. But without that like sort of main man, without somebody they can rely on to change games, it's going to be difficult to bet on them to progress in a knockout format.
Yeah, and obviously, return of the Open Cup this year, so potential to advance in that. That's exciting. But looking towards then predictions, obviously, kind of given a window into it with there's predictions with a number 9, and then there's predictions without a number 9.
100%.
Where do you see the team at the end of the season and heading into the playoffs? Like what?
I think Yeah, like I said earlier, it does heavily depend on a number 9 just because of how big that hole is in the team. Um, I think that the acquisitions of Max and Acosta are solid. I think they did really well in the draft to bring in sort of high potential players. Um, but considering how few people they actually lost over the offseason in terms of solid contributors, like they didn't lose any one there or haven't so far lost a single one of their like out and out every match starters. And that's like a really good point, like in their favor. I think we're going to see a similar performance of last year where they hover near around the top for most of the season. I would not like unless that signing comes before the window, I would not bet on them to repeat the first place Western finish. But given the amount of talent they have, playoffs is almost non-negotiable. There would be no excuse even without a number 9 for them missing the playoffs. So I think we're gonna the they would probably average somewhere around like fourth, third in the West.
Yeah, because I kind of see with obviously Nashville coming over to the Western
Yeah,
Conference, I think they'll struggle with travel, but I think their side and their style, they just so sure in it, and I think they're going to be. Well, I think they'll be a top 4 seed in the West, and I think obviously Seattle, I think will be there, and I see Colorado getting that home playoff game again. But
and it's worth noting, like Nashville, coached by Gary Smith,
yeah,
the man who led Colorado to MLS Cup in 2010, using pretty much the same style of play he's using now. So on one hand, new competition, but the Rapids are familiar with Nashville's style of play, just by virtue of being managed by the same guy.
yeah. And Jozy, I just want to say thank you very much for coming on today. It's been a
Absolutely.
pleasure. And I noticed in the background, I like that Everton scarf as an Everton fan
Oh,
myself. Yeah.
thank you. Yeah. Uh, most of the scarves I have on the wall I've gotten from the actual stadiums I've been to. That one I traded with a fan in England. I want to say like 4 or 5 years ago. But yeah, always happy to add to the collection.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, man, and hopefully we speak again soon. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.